Welcome back, everyone, to the last day of BioFarm. We are delighted now to go to the UK to join Iain Tollhurst. And Iain is the director of Tollhurst Organic Farm, which is between the Chilterns and the River Thames. Iain, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for joining us. If you have any
pleasure.
questions, please get them in during Iain's talk in the comment box. Questions and comments, we will put them to Iain at the end of his talk, or use hashtag BioFarm21 on social media. We'll keep an eye on that as well. Iain, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be there. If it's not in person, I've done a few in-person visits to Ireland, and I'm always very pleased to be there. Ramial chipped wood, also called Ramial chipped wood, is something which perhaps most people have probably never come across. We've been doing work on it now on the farm for quite some years. I think it's about 7 or 8 years now. And the word Ramial comes from Ramial, which is a Romanian word, which is small branch wood. So we're going to look at how Ramial chipped wood has possibilities on farm. Most of the work I'm connected with has actually been on my own farm here in southern UK. So our farm business, we're just about 20 acres. We're very intensive. We grow a lot of veg on the 20 acres. We're a completely stock-free system, so we have no inputs from livestock at all. The system is very much developed around the use of green manures within the rotation. We're using Ramial chipped wood as part of that rotation. We're also doing wood chip composting, and the system is mostly self-sufficient. We're running the farm without any inputs at all, so no fertilizers, no lime, no manures, no inputs. We raise all our own plants. We have an area of agroforestry which contributes towards the wood supply, and everything we do on the farm is sold directly from the farm. And this field we're looking at here, this is a picture I took a year ago. This is what I call my 50 shades of green. And this is our brassica rotation. It's a 2-acre block. And this is where we conducted some of the trials into Ramial wood chip a few years ago. We have extensive field cropping. Here we are, we're just a little way from the River Thames. In fact, sometimes we're uncomfortably too close to the River Thames. It gets right up to the very edge of our field. We have 2 fields there in field cropping. And then we have a wall garden, which is 2 acres, where we grow a lot more intensive crops. Now, the problem with horticulture, in particular with horticulture, but also with agriculture, is the demands on fertility. And in horticulture, that's particularly acute because we are expecting an awful lot of cropping. We're expecting in many terms, very diverse cropping. And we're expecting to get pretty good yields. We're using lots of cultivations. If you're on a field scale system, you are inevitably using cultivation tillage system, although it may well be a reduced tillage. There's still a lot of tillage, a lot of pressure on the soil, potential problems of the soil structure, potential problems of loss of carbon. And then there's another issue which is particular to horticulture, and that's the use of substrates for plant raising. Most substrates, even in organic systems today, are still based or partly based on peat products, and there's obviously a real problem around that. And then for livestock farms, there's the issue of bedding. Bedding can often be in short supply, and there may well be possible alternatives in the use of Ramial wood chip for bedding. So what exactly is Ramial wood chip? Well, in general terms, it's small branch wood up to around 70 millimeters. It's not specific about size. 70 millimeters is sort of the standard size material, but it could be a little bit larger. It does depend really on the age of the wood as much as anything. The older the wood, the more heartwood you'll get. And with heartwood, you get very little protein. You don't get the degrading of the material in the same way you get with branch wood. It tends to be much harder, it's longer lasting, and it doesn't contain the proteins and the sugars that you get in younger wood. So younger wood is to be preferred, but anything up to sort of 70 millimeters, it could be up to 100 if it's something very fast growing. Generally go for deciduous wood. Coniferous wood does not make good Ramial chipped wood. In fact, we've never used it for Ramial chipped wood. We do use it in other ways, and I'll tell you about that later. But conifer woods are quite difficult. They're full of terpenes and things which perhaps you don't want in your soil. Ramio chipwood is applied to the soil surface. Now, most people, if they know anything about wood chip at all, they will be probably very concerned about nitrogen lockup. So it's very important this is done in the right way. We only apply Ramio chipwood to green manure crops, and these are green manure crops which would be in the ground for at least a year or more. So there's a high percentage of legumes and other plants within that mix. We do an all species mix with about 25 different species. So it's applied to the soil surface. It's never worked in. It can be used, and we do have some farms, arable farms, that are using it in arable situations and mixing it very shallow in the soil surface, and that can work very well, providing you're careful how you do it. The important thing about Ramio wood chip, it's a really good supply of carbon, and it's long-term carbon, which is likely to stay in your soil for a much longer period of time than, say, straw or green manure crops, which tend to disappear quite quickly. Ramio chipwood is really good at improving soil fauna, particularly fungi. Fungi and wood chip go together, and the association with mycorrhiza with wood chip is very important. Now, wood chip in itself is not nutrient rich. It tends to be fairly low in nutrients, but it can improve the soil's ability to take up nutrients. So we've been involved in a trial for 3 years with our farm and 2 other farms, one of which is organic and one is conventional. And we've been looking primarily at how Ramio wood chip behaves in a real life situation. So this is done within a cropping farm. It's not a trial on its own. It's part of a cropping farm. And the picture on the left there, this is the trials we had set up on our farm. We had 3 areas of trial. So we ran it. The actual trial went for 4 years, and we were looking at a range of aspects within this trial. It's relatively small. It's around 1 hectare on each plot. There's a lot being written up. If you really want to study this a bit more, I can definitely refer you to this technical guide, which was done by the Organic Research Centre as a result of the trials. It's Ramio wood chip in organic in agricultural production. There's actually 3 versions of this. It's a really good read for those of you that like to read technical information. It covers a lot of detail, and it's available from the Organic Research Centre. I think possibly free of charge. I'm not sure, but I'm sure you can find out from them. The 3 farms are our own farm, which is on a sandy silt loam, and we were using Ramio chipwood from a mixed hedgerow. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But we were also comparing it with composted wood chip and also control with nothing. Another farm is Wakeland's Agroforestry, which is also an organic farm, and they were using poplar from their agroforestry system, and willow. They have another hazel, willow, poplar, coppice, and they also had a control of nothing. And the third farm was Down Farm, which is a conventional arable farm, using, again, mixed hedgerow and green waste, compost, and the control. So we're basically 3 treatments, and the control, of course, is very important to see what happens if you do nothing. The basic nutrients, we had all the various materials were analysed. We looked at green waste compost, which is either from an industrial composting site or, in our case, from our own green waste compost, which is primarily wood chip, comparing it with Ramio chipwood. And you'll see that in general terms, green waste compost has almost twice the nutrient that Ramio chipwood has got. But there's a reason for that. The reason is that once you've composted wood chip or any organic waste, you end up with a much, much smaller concentrated amount of nutrients. So the nutrient levels are actually probably very similar. Earthworm populations, as part of the trial, there was very extensive data monitoring, and one of the things which is a really good indicator of soil health is earthworms. Earthworms really love wood chip. They love to pull it into their burrows, they love to collect it, they love the security that wood chip offers them, and they also, of course, love the carbon. Fungi love wood chip, and you'll see the picture there at the top. This was taken about 6 weeks after we'd applied Ramio chipwood to a very rich ley, which was primarily made up of legumes and 20 other species of plant. And you can see there that the fungi are very, very prevalent. In fact, we had a whole field full of fungi for a while. And soil biology loves wood chip as well. It really does make a huge difference to the biology of the soil. And we're looking at wood chip really it's not to do with nutrient input, it's really to do with the way we're going to enhance the biological fertility of the soil. The picture there, by the way, is just some of the worms that were collected from our trial site, and the earthworm counts were very extensive, done over 3 years, over 1 hectare period of land, and done very, very carefully with great effort. It's a very big job to sample earthworm populations. You can see there from the tables that we have a very, very healthy earthworm population. In fact, since this was done, we've done further earthworm counts, so we've now got our earthworm count up to around 1,500 per metre. That's 15 million per hectare. This is a staggering figure. We tried to put an estimate on weight of what those worms would actually weigh over a hectare, and we've come up with a figure of around 10 to 12 tonnes. This is 10 to 12 tonnes of earthworms. So we may well have no livestock on the farm, but we have a very, very high population of earthworms. And other farms also showed very, very high earthworm populations, and these had increased quite significantly from the controls previously. Number of species is very important. I had no idea there were so many different species of earthworm, but we've managed to get 11. Down Farm has 8, and Wakelands Agroforestry has 6. We've been organic for over 40 years, and I think the figures we get here are perhaps a reflection of the fact that this is a very long established organic system, whereas Down Farm is relatively new to the use of wood chip and organic materials. So the earthworm count was very good on all farms. Now, the source of ramure wood chip is important, and what we're really trying to ascertain on the farm is how much of our farm would we need to plant up with trees in order to provide a whole carbon cycle. As a net exporter of carbon, because we are producing food, we produce around 140 tonnes of vegetables every year from our 20 acres. We're obviously exporting carbon as well. Up till the time we started using wood chip, we were pretty much holding our own in terms of carbon with very extensive green manure cropping. We had increased the carbon content of the soil very slightly from 4% to 4.5, which took 25 years, so quite a slow increase. Since we've been using wood chip, we've seen a much more rapid increase in carbon, and we're now up to over 5.5%, which we think is quite comfortable. We don't want to go too high because there's problems with that. So we were really thinking, now, where's all the carbon going to come from in the future? You know, we were conscious that we needed to try and at least maintain our carbon content and ideally increase it to a certain level. So the idea really was to see how much of the farm would we need to set aside for timber. And we've come out of a rough figure, sort of the back of a fag packet calculation really, but we're looking at around 10%, between 10 and 20% of the total farm would need to be growing wood in order to support an increase in carbon in the soil. Now, we've already got some sources on the farm. We've got a coppice and we've got some hedgerows, so these are important areas for material. And we've also got agroforestry. This is a field we set up about 7 years ago with agroforestry strips. They're 25 metres apart. They're a mixed range of species, all indigenous species, but we've also got apple trees in there. And the idea of this really was to generate increased carbon for the future, in that we could then be either coppicing or pollarding this material for use on the land. And that field at the moment you're looking at, the one in the very foreground, is presently half-life fields in green manure, because our rotation is such that we have 2.5 years solid of green manure within a 7-year rotation, and we have lots of green manure at other points. So we're already quite keen to make sure that soil is well covered. We've got lots of green manure in place. We're not disturbing it more than necessary. We're on sort of very reduced tillage, and we're looking at, you know, where's our carbon going to come from in the future. So trees are an obvious bet. We planted a willow plantation in 2004. It's on a piece of land which was really quite wet. We'd given up trying to farm it. We'd had all sorts of problems with tractors stuck in the winter, and it just became a nightmare. primarily because the water table comes up very high. In the winter, we're very close to River Thames. So I decided the only thing really to do was to plant trees. And at that time, the intention with the trees really was firewood. We were thinking, well, we need firewood. We all live on the farm. We have wood burners. So the idea really was to generate firewood material as much as anything biomass for burning. And I chose white willow because it grows indigenously. In fact, we have trees very close by which we were able to take cuttings from. It's a good firewood. It burns very well. It's quite hot. It's a bit faster than ash, but it does give a good amount of heat. It's quick to dry and it's quite easy to manage. So I planted this half-acre coppice up. There's 120 trees, 5 meters apart. We started coppicing at year 7, and we're on a 7-year rotation now where we cut every year over 7 years. We have very convenient. You have 7 rows of trees. So that's 1 row a year, and we're getting quite good yields now. It's now been in for almost 20 years. Last 2019, the last time I took records, we harvested 14 trees, and that yielded around 13 cubic meters of ramule chip wood and a similar amount of firewood. So we're picking out the larger material for firewood and leaving the smaller stuff for chipping. And we chip most of the small material. We do leave some on the ground. We actually leave some very small material back on the coppice stalls, and that is there really to keep deer from grazing the emerging shoots. So we're taking the entire crop, and I like coppice. I think coppice is fantastic. It offers such wide environmental benefits in terms of biodiversity. We have bird life there, which we couldn't have imagined 20 years ago. We've got insect life, we've got all sorts of stuff going on. It's an absolute hive of activity, and it's completely self-perpetuating. This, in theory, this could go on for thousands of years. I mean, there are coppice around in the UK that have been going for 1,000 years on the same trees. So it has a very good longevity. So we're looking at coppice as being one of our main sources of ramule chipwood, but also the agroforestry, which I mentioned earlier in the picture on the left. This is the agroforestry. You can see the row of trees on the left, but we're also growing crops within that. And this is our crop of squash and pumpkins from 2 years ago. It's all grown within a green manure lay. So we've already got the green manure established. And the trees will be harvesting those. We'll actually start in 2 years' time with coppicing. We've got enough trees that we can coppice 1 row every year. We have 6 rows in total, so we'd be coppicing that. We don't know what year we're going to get at a minute, but we expect it would be similar to that we get from the willow coppice. And then we have hedges. We'd never really considered hedges as being a potential fertility input to the farm. And if we were to look at our traditional hedges, which we have within our 20 acres, we have nearly 2 miles of hedges. Our fields are quite small. So we have potentially quite a large pool of material which we could be using. However, some of those hedges are quite old. Many were planted in pre-Victorian times. In fact, one is, we know is 1,000 years old and came from the original woodland that was there. They're not hugely productive, particularly ones that the Victorians planted, because they tend to be mostly blackthorn and hawthorn. However, we do have a couple of hedges, and this picture is one of them that I planted 30 years ago, which is a range of mixed species. We've got hazel, spindle, ash, willow, hornbeam, alder, things like that. And this is much, much more productive. It's a double row hedge. So we started to harvest that, and we started about 15 years ago, and we've now cut it 3 times in that period. And we're getting, on average, it varies from year to year, but we're getting roughly around between 1 and 2 cubic meters for every 10 meter of hedge. Now, these hedges have proved to be hugely more productive than the old hedges that we inherited. So if I was to start the farm again and I had no hedges at all, I would be feeling much more positive about planting trees which were going to be much more productive and much easier to manage. Mixed species are the way to go. We don't really want monoculture in hedges anymore than we want monoculture in our fields. And definitely new hedges are much, much more productive than the old hedges. The old hedges, we've only actually coppiced one so far, and we've coppiced it primarily to allow it to be laid. The amount of material we got was relatively small, despite the fact it hadn't been cut for, I think, probably 50 or 60 years. So we know that the difference between a purpose planted hedge and an existing hedge is quite enormous. So if you get the opportunity, really the idea is to plant new hedges for coppicing, for rammy or chipwood. Now, application is quite important. The other thing I didn't say about rammy or chipwood, it's something which is done in the winter. You don't make rammy or chipwood in the summer, and you actually don't want the leaves. The leaves can upset the process of the rammy or chip when it's applied to soil. You're actually better doing it in the winter. It's much easier to do in the winter. We employ a tree surgeon for a couple of days. He comes along with his mate and their chainsaws, and they do the coppicing, and they also do the chipping. They have a very large timber wood chipper, and they chip it straight into our compost spreader, and we spread it from there. So it's a winter operation which fits in much better with the farm calendar, and because it's not a highly volatile, it doesn't have lots of highly soluble nitrogen or anything. There's no problems with applying wood chip in nitrogen sensitive zones or any other problems of that type, because it's pretty much locked up. The nutrient in the wood is already locked in, so there's almost really no danger of causing any pollution incidents. So we're applying around 70 cubic meters, which is about roughly 35 tons. It's about sort of a ton to 2 cubic meters. Given that rammy or chipwood is fresh, and it needs to be fresh, we don't leave this stacked up for weeks or even days before we apply it. We apply it straight away. If you leave it stacked up, it will start to heat up, which is the start of a composting process. That's not what you want. You want to be using rammy or chip very fresh, straight from the tree. So really it has to be spread within days, which is why we generally have it directed straight into the spreader and then spread it immediately. The ideal arrangement would be to apply it early in the spring when you've got a potential crop to take up nutrients. On our farm, we only ever apply rammy or chipwood, or indeed anything, including compost, to green manure crops. We never apply anything to bare soil. I think it's very wasteful to apply any material to bare soil. Even more so if you plough it in, you may as well not bother. So it's always applied to the soil surface. And 70 cubic meters, which is quite a big part, but when you spread it over a hectare, we're talking about 7 millimeters thick. It's a very, very small amount. And here we are, the spreader. We have an old kid spreader, and that's going on around 7 millimeters thick. It's 7 litres per square metre, or 70 tonnes per hectare. And you'll see the picture on the left with the brush. It gives you some idea of the amount of cover going on the ground. You can actually still see the green manure showing through underneath. And this would have been done, in this case, it would be fairly early in the spring, probably February, March time, when we're expecting growth. It could be done over winter if conditions allow. There's no reason why you couldn't be doing it in the middle of winter if it's dry enough. We tend to be fairly sticky in the winter, so we tend to avoid going on the land with machinery unless it's very dry. You'll see from the chips there, there's a mixture of different shapes and sizes. We've got some sort of fairly long pieces. We've also got lots of little tiny small chips, and some of it will almost be dust-like. It does vary depending on the quality of the chipper. It also depends a lot on the sharpness of the chipper. The chipping machinery is quite important. For us, we're okay with this. We don't mind the long bits. We're not concerned about any problems with nitrogen lockup because we're applying it to the surface. The final process of this happens on the soil. So we're actually looking and asking soil biology to help us out here to process this material. If we left it in a heap, it would heat up. Putting it on the ground means we actually contain all the material. We don't lose, potentially we lose very little. Composting has its losses, but this way we feel we're probably losing very little in terms of nutrient from the wood chip. And the final processing has been done on the ground. We have a situation there where we have a long-term green manure with 25 species of different plants, not just legumes, but all sorts of things, wildflowers as well, we put in. So there's a lot of biological activity. We're at a point in the rotation when fertility is coming very high. We have a stable situation with a huge number of earthworms. As I said earlier, we have over 10, 15 tonnes per acre, per hectare. So a lot of potential activity there. And most of this material will disappear very, very quickly indeed. I'm just amazed at how quickly this stuff disappears. By the time the green manure starts to grow in April, May, there will be very little evidence of this wood chip around. We do this twice within a rotation of 7 years, so it's applied year 1 and 2 in the rotation. And we have seen some incredible benefits in terms of yield and crop, but there's other benefits too. It's not just about the fungal biological activity. There's also very clear indications, and some work has been done on the way that wood chip applied to soil, as indeed with compost, will give plants real health giving properties. It will fight pests and disease. It will encourage the right sort of biology in the soil to deal with pest problems and soil problems. We have seen nothing but benefit from using this material on the farm. And then rammed chipwood as bedding material, I don't have any personal experience of this, but I know that farms are starting to look at this, and there's a couple of links there which you might want to follow up if you're looking at bedding for livestock. It has some real advantages over straw. In some parts of the country it's cheaper, but also there's some real health advantages in wood chip as opposed to straw or other materials. So it's really worth looking at for livestock farmers as well. I'm going to move on to composted wood chip, because as well as using rammed chip wood, we also compost wood chip. And this is a different product altogether. It's mostly a product that comes from tree surgeons. We have a lot of tree surgeons in the area. We have quite a lot of trees in this part of the world, and a lot of them belong to domestic gardens, and often they get too big and they end up falling down or have to be trimmed because of neighbour complaints. So wood chip is freely available. It's not freely available in every part of the country, but certainly here it is freely available. We don't pay for it. In fact, we could, if we wanted, we could actually charge to receive it, but we don't. It comes from, we have a source of just one tree surgeon only. It comes as a mixture of different trees. It can be all sorts. A lot of it would be ornamental trees, so there'll be non-indigenous trees, but also indigenous trees. We're getting, at the moment, quite a lot of ash because the ash dieback. We also get oak, we get holly, we get hornbeam, we get quite a lot of conifer, which can be a problem. So we're trying to reduce how much conifer we get. Cupressus leylandii are a bad disease in rural parts of the UK. People plant them in their hedges, in their gardens when they're a foot high, and within 10 years they're 20 foot high and causing problems. So potentially there's a lot of conifer. We have to try and reduce how much conifer we get. We don't want more than about 25–30% really within this. It may contain green leaf. In fact, during the summer there will be a lot of green material, and also it contains sticks and twigs and occasional stones. You'll get the odd beer can, but mostly it's very, very clean. The interesting thing about wood chip from domestic sources is the chances of any chemical contamination is extremely low. Mostly this material has never been sprayed, so we're quite confident it's safe and it's clean. The picture there you see is how we're composting it. We're windrowing it. And we're windrowing it into rows, usually about 40–50 meters long. The picture's a bit outdated. We're going for taller and wider rows now, and a bigger machine for turning, but we're using a medium-sized excavator, which we hire every few months to turn it. And the turning is actually done roughly every 12 to 15 weeks. During the course of the life of the heap, we will turn it probably around 3 to 4 times maximum, and that's enough. We don't need to go for a very fine product. We're going for a reasonably coarse product, but where we are using it for plant raising, we do compost it for longer. The process is very simple. We don't add anything, we don't take anything away. There is inevitably some losses, but we are losing some nutrient from this during the composting process. We've never experienced any problem of leachate. We're not in a very wet part of the country. In fact, we're very dry, but even in wetter areas, I've seen that composted wood chip is rarely subject to leachate. You don't get the sort of losses you get with manure and other green waste materials. We do add a little bit of green waste material to this. It's really from our packing distribution of our own vegetables, so it's quite a small amount, and also waste crops, when we finish harvesting in tunnels and greenhouses, we take all the material out in order to get the next crop in. So we add that to the compost heap, but it's a relatively small amount. We've used it for plant propagation, and we did some very extensive trials on that. And there's another link there to the agroecology website, which has some quite interesting information about the trial. We were really looking at this material as a substrate to completely eliminate the use of peat. Now, peat is due to be banned in horticulture in the UK in the next few years. It should have been banned decades ago, but even some organic growers are still using peat-based material, which I think is completely wrong. So we haven't used peat-based material for over 30 years, and we've always used something like this. We've always had really reliable results. During the last 25 years, we've raised over 1 million plants in trays like this for planting out in the field and to the tunnels. And I can quite safely say we have never, ever had a single failure of a crop due to this plant raising technique. So we know it works. What we didn't really know was how it compared with other materials. So this trial was really about comparing our wood chip compost, which is simply nothing more than wood chip compost, which has gone through a 10mm grader, and we add a little bit of vermiculite in order to improve the water holding capacity, but also to dilute the compost. The substrate is very high, it's very high in nitrogen, so you can get growth which is really too lush. So we've had to dilute it a bit in order to limit the excessive growth of some crops, particularly things like brassica. The lettuce plants you see there on the right, you can see from that there's no shortage of nitrogen. Given that they are growing in pure wood chip, you can see that the nitrogen issue is really something which does not exist. Most people have big paranoias about wood chip and nitrogen, but providing you use it carefully, there's no problem at all. So this is a different product from Ramuel chip wood. This has been through a process of composting, and what we've discovered with the trials that we set up with ORC was that we don't really need to compost wood chip in order to make it a usable product in the field. We've got just as good a result using Ramuel chip wood as we have using composted chip wood, without the hassle of composting, without the time involved because it's a 12-month period, without the fuel involved because there's a certain amount of element of fuel being used for the turning and management of those heaps. So a lower input system, and Ramuel chipwood has really worked well for us, and it's worked well for the other farmers that have been using it. I think it's got great potential. It means that you could, in theory, you could be growing all your own fertility on the farm. And if you're a net exporter of high value crops as we are, then you really do need to consider where your fertility is going to be coming from in the future, because importing fertility from somebody else's farm may not be an option in the future, because if you're bringing manure from elsewhere, you are in effect importing land onto your farm. We call it ghost acres, and ghost acres may not be an option in the future with the cost of moving materials around and also the need to keep fertility on the farm where it's developed. So the idea of using Ramuel chipwood really is very much a part of the whole system of moving towards being self-sufficient within the farm in terms of fertility. So the farm can grow all its own fertility and still export food from that farm without suffering in terms of its carbon losses in soil or soil health. And we have really seen some incredible changes in the last sort of 5 or 10 years since we've been using wood on the farm in terms of fertility of the farm, lack of pest and disease, and general health of crops has really become much better. We have almost no issues at all with crop health. Yields are really good. As part of the Organic Research Centre trial, we were following on beyond the trial with cropping, and we had 2 crops, the first one being potatoes and the second one being brassicas. And on the potato crop, we have an official calculation of yield on potatoes of 51.5 tonnes per hectare, which by anybody's standards, even on conventional land, would be considered quite good. We're not on good land at all. We're on grade 3B land. It's very, very large for vegetable production. So to get that sort of yield, I think says a lot about how good the effect that Ramuel chip and composted wood chip has had on the farm, but also it's part of a system. It's not just down to round chip wood. The success of our farm is down to rotations, soil management, tillage, and the whole management of biodiversity. So I don't want people to think that round chip wood is a magical product which, if you put it on, is going to create a wonderful farm. You have to use it as part of a whole systems approach to farm management. Okay, I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. Yes, so we move on to questions now, I think, yes?
And thank you so much. We've had lots of questions coming in, and we're just going to get straight into them to get through them. Nigel asks, could you use ash with dieback for ramial chipped wood?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because there's obviously a lot of this coming out, and there's been a little bit of research done into, the potential problem with trees with disease, and there are so many tree diseases around these days. It's something which really does need thinking about. To date, the research that's been done, as far as I know, has shown no negative problems at all with using diseased wood for ramial chip wood or through composting processes. So I think it's probably safe to assume that you can. I would say, though, if you had, say, fire blight disease and you were an orchard, you may not want to use it in that situation. But I think anywhere else, I think that, if your soil is healthy, you've got lots of fungal activity, and you've got all the bacteria and microbes there, which you should have, any diseases in the wood are going to disappear very rapidly. And given that most of these diseases only actually live in the tree when it's alive anyway, and once you've chipped it, the tree is obviously going to die. So I think it's pretty safe to assume we can. Okay.
He also asked, can I chip miscanthus grown on my farm for this process?
You could. Miscanthus is very difficult to chip. You can sort of shred it. I'm not sure what machines they use for chopping up miscanthus. I think forage harvest is more likely to be the thing rather than wood chipper. But yes, you could. It won't have the same effect because there isn't as much carbon in miscanthus as there is in tree wood. But it will certainly add a lot of carbon.
Okay. What do you think about it being used instead of soil paths in horticulture?
Yes, we actually do that. We have a no-dig system in tunnels, and we do use wood chip on the pathways. It's very effective. We put it down to 2 or 3 inches thick. It controls weeds. It rots pretty quickly, in fact, quicker than we'd like. It generates the most incredible earthworm populations. And in fact, we've stopped applying compost where we're doing that because we no longer feel we need to, because the pathways are actually supplying fertility for the crop. The earthworms move it around. So yeah, it's a really good system.
So Marie says on the back of that question that Klaus and Sean, that you had a famous, would you believe, battle during your NOTS course this year on whether to have wood chip on paths in a poly tunnel. Who was right then?
Well, technically Klaus was right, but I was really right, if you know what I mean.
Klaus was what? Klaus was? Right.
Was kind of right, but he from the wrong perspective, in the sense that I was right with the idea of the wood chip, if we agree with Iain, but Iain, mine was 100% conifer.
Well, in that case, no, I wouldn't use it.
Yeah.
I mean, the maximum for conifer really has to be about 20%. I mean, it has beautiful smell, lovely aroma, but that's from the terpenes and phenols coming out, and they can be damaging to, so I suspect, I don't know, maybe Christine could tell us more about this, but I think they could be damaging to soil health in that sort of quantity.
Yeah, Sean.
But Iain, on that point you mentioned, and there's always a discussion on this, and it always comes back to CN ratio, but you mentioned something about if you leave the wood chip on top of the ground, is that what you're saying? It doesn't affect it?
It doesn't affect it. The CM ratio before you start, I mean, with our willow, we know that the CM ratio is around about 450 to 1. I mean, it's horrendous, you know. Where we've collected up what remains of the wood chip on the surface of the soil, if we can find it 6 months later, and look at the CM ratio, it's down to about 10 or 15 to 1. So it's down to, you know, where we would like it. Most of the material is going to be processed on or very close to the surface. Worms only pull down very small bits. They don't pull down large bits. The rest of it is broken down by fungal activity, and the number of mushrooms and toadstools and all sorts of psychedelic things we get growing there is quite incredible. The stuff disappears rapidly, providing you've got the right soil biology to deal with it. If you were to put this on a very sterile, say for example we went into an arable field that had been in a conventional rotation with lots of inputs for many decades, if we were to use ramial chip in that situation, firstly, it wouldn't rot down hardly at all for several years. It would stay as it was. And secondly, if it did get into the soil, it would lock up nitrogen. So, we are looking at using a wood product in what is already a fairly well advanced biological system. And I know from previous bitter experience of 40 years ago when I turned in some wood waste, which is quite different from wood chip. Wood waste is from joinery and manufacturing process and in seasoned wood. I turned that into a field as part of the strawberry production plant, and we had a nitrogen robbery for 5 years after that. It took a lot to put it right. So, people need to be aware that the difference between rammy or chip wood and fresh, non-fresh wood from joinery, like pallets chopped up into wood chip is not the same thing. You just do not want to be using that sort of material.
Sure.
Thanks, Iain. One other thing before I let you on back to the other questions. An organic farmer I know was using standing pads some years ago, wood chip standing pads for cattle. And I remember him telling me that he'd never use it again because he spread it on the land about a year later. And so I take it was a mixture of cow manure and wood chip. Now, I'm probably confident saying it was probably 100% conifer, but he said he destroyed the silage feeds with it. He said
right. If it was conifer, it would cause problems, but spreading it onto grass, normally, it does depend on the amount. I mean, if you're putting on huge amounts, you will cause a problem, but the sort of amounts we're talking about, which is 70 odd cubic metres per hectare, even if it was conifer, I wouldn't expect it to do damage as such. It may not have this desired effect for a while. I could be wrong because I don't know anybody that's done that, but I think the fact that it was primarily conifer and may have been coming from joinery workshops and not green material, not wet material from trees, may have been the other factor in that.
No, it would have been wood chip from the forestry situation, but they're actually much bigger than, we'll say, a normal wood chip, and I wonder would that be part of it too?
Yeah. Definitely, the bigger the wood chip, the slower it is to break down. The wood chip is more about the length of the wood chip rather than the size. So very short wood chip chopped across the grain degrade much quicker because the fungi and bacteria can get in from the end because the cells of wood are longitudinal, not crossways. And also, the very large material will obviously just hang around on the surface and not get pulled in by worms. So that also has a factor as well. So,
that's really
conifer often tends to make very large, long chips. It doesn't chip very well. And conifer, because of the resins and the phenols, is actually very, very hardy in terms of rotting. It doesn't degrade anything like as fast. And oak will rot much quicker than pine or conifer will in that situation.
We have a question here, Iain, from Janine. Others use fresh green shoots from coppice trees when the sap rises in the spring. What's the difference between nutrient levels in branches in spring versus winter?
Well, the ones in the spring will have a much lower CN ratio, so potentially they will compost much quicker. They're not suitable for rammy or chip wood because there's too much green, and the whole process of rammy or chip wood is really about carbon, pure carbon, without the nitrogen, really. You don't want the nitrogen. So they're two different products, and the very green, fresh material is great if you want to make compost, and it's a wonderful product. It's not as easy as chip, because chipping green material can be quite difficult compared with chipping brown material, but it has a different use, really. It would be better used straight through the compost heap.
Thank you. And the final question, Marie asks, hi Iain, would chipped Cyprus leylandi used as a weed suppressant mulch increase acidity?
Yes, that's an interesting question. It will certainly keep the weeds down. It will keep the weeds down better than any other tree type. In terms of acidity, it depends on where the trees are grown. Now, we've tested some of the leylandi that comes into our farm occasionally, and it's got a pH of around 7. But that's because it's growing on soil, which has a pH of around 7 or 7.5. So if it's grown on very acid soils, which conifers often are, then it will be acid. If it's growing on alkaline soil, it could well be alkaline.
Okay, Klaus.
Yeah, thank you, Iain. Just a quick question. Could I use the wood chip, ramial wood chip, for purple sprouting broccolis or garlic that's overwintered directly on them? Or why did you say only for green manures?
We use it only onto green manure crops because at that point in the rotation, soil is much more able to cope with that influx of carbon because there's a lot of earthworm activity, there's a lot of biology, all the fungi and bacteria there as there should be. So it processes it well. We don't use it on a growing crop, other than we do have a deep mulch of ramel chipwood on rhubarb to keep the weeds down. So if you want to use it as a weed suppressant, then yes, you could, but you could never turn that material in. It would take much longer to rot down. I mean, the more you put on, obviously, the longer it's going to take to degrade into basic materials. So, using it as a weed suppressing mulch is not really the intention it's meant for, other than it's really useful in perennial. We use it on asparagus as well in perennial cropping, but in annual cropping, I wouldn't want to, because if you're going to even very lightly till that soil, or just try and move it to one side in order to plant something through the mulch, you could accidentally introduce wood into the soil. That would lock nitrogen up for quite some time.
Iain, thank you so much. You've given such an interesting presentation. Thank you for answering the questions as well. Is there a way for people to follow the progress of what you do, or not?
Yes and no. There's some information on our website. The Organic Research Centre has a lot of the information in terms of the trials, and also the agroecology website has a lot of information there. I pop up all over the place on YouTube and different things. If you do a search on my name, you'll come up with all sorts of stuff on wood chip.
And your website?
Website is tollhurstorganic.co.uk.
Okay, we're going to say goodbye, Iain. Thank you very much for all your help and all your information.
My pleasure. Bye.
So we're going away for a 2-minute break, but when we come back, we're going to go straight into Dave Beecher's presentation on the Danu Group, EIP, with the kind of progress update on that, and he'll be here actually to answer all your questions as well. So back in about 2 minutes.